Thank you for being here. We are really pleased that you've chosen to be a part of our class. Next Sunday morning, we'll still be dealing with the Gospel of Matthew. Our bishop will be here, but not with you. Our youth are doing so wonderfully well, as you know. We had more youth participating week after week last year than we had had any year in the last 30. And this year, they're exceeding what they did last year. Audra Fogel, Debbie Peterson are wonderful. They're really doing the great job for us. So they've asked our bishop if he would be with the youth next Sunday during Sunday school, and he said he would. So they will have opportunity. They will find him to be warm and gracious, eager to share anything they want to ask him. So that'll be a special time. He will not be with you. I will be with you, and we'll do Matthew. But 2 weeks from today, we're going to have our two ministers of adult Christian education, the Reverend Amy Venable and the Reverend Dr. Bill Crowell, teach you about the Da Vinci Code. This is a phenomenon. I mean, it's unheard of that somebody would sell 60 million copies of a book. Just unbelievable. It was the second best-selling book in the world last year. Gratefully, the Bible was still number one. Don't know how many of them get read, but it still sells well. And the Bible was number one. The Da Vinci Code was number two. So there are a lot of questions because without going into it, there are so many just blatant lies about our faith in the book. And how Dan Brown could say with a straight face that he thought he was just putting together a story, but he became a believer, is unbelievable to me. That a man who's supposed to be as bright as he could even make such a statement. But anyway, they're going to help you with that and show you the many, just things that are untrue, absolutely untrue. The Roman Catholic Church is the one beaten up most in this book, but it really drives right to the heart of the faith of all of us. His contention is that Jesus did not die on the cross, that his body was spirited away, that he married Mary Magdalene, that they had a daughter, and so on. So these are simply untruths. When he talks about how many Gospels there were in that first century, he's wrong about that. Gospel of Mary was not written in the first century, wasn't written by eyewitnesses nor disciples of eyewitnesses. It was written by a group of mystics in Egypt 200 years later and so on. So anyway, you need to be here if it's of interest to you at all. And if it's not of interest, come and support anyway. Come and support. I think you'll have a big group of people here 2 weeks from today and the weeks following. I know Amy and Bill have been working hard on this. They're ready to make their presentations to you, and they'll entertain any question as you go along. They may want to take them in a certain order and deal with certain things on certain Sundays, but they intend to deal with every question you have in these Sundays in June. One more week, next week of Matthew, and then, of course, wherever we end next week, then you and I will pick up again after these lessons on the Da Vinci Code are completed. Let's pray. God, thank you for your book. We are people of faith who believe that you inspired this book and that there are truths here, things eternally true. Those are the ones we're looking for, and we pray that you will help us find them, and having found them, apply them to the living of our lives and our life together as Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, we're going to begin chapter 20, verse 29, and the first place mentioned is Jericho. I want to tell you, just again, some of you have heard me tell this, the first look I had at Jericho. Our guide really set this up dramatically for us. We had been in Jerusalem. We had been north to the Sea of Galilee. We had been in Israel already a week or 8 days maybe by that time. When he told us at dinner one night, tomorrow we must get up earlier. I want us to be at Masada down on the Dead Sea before it gets too hot. I want us to be the first group in line for the cable cars so that you don't have to stand there in the sun for 2 or 3 hours if we wait later in the day. So let's get up before anybody else, and let's get there before anybody else, and so on. So that's what we did. We got up early the next morning, drove south from Jerusalem. Coming from Jerusalem, you descend 17 miles, but they took us not straight to the Jordan River, but down another main highway and down along the Dead Sea. And when you get about halfway down to where the 9 would be, if that were the face of a clock, or maybe the 8 even, we came to Masada. And you recall that Masada was the old winter palace of Herod the Great. It's sheer rock walls to this thing, hundreds and hundreds of feet high, so impenetrable that it took the Roman army and its best engineers 3.5 years to build enough ramp up to it so that they could take it from the Zealots. This was after the destruction of Jerusalem, after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 A.D., that first century of the Common Era. Today, when you stand on Masada, you can still see way down below you the campfires of the Romans. I mean, the outlines of the campfires of the Romans 2,000 years ago, because it doesn't rain and it doesn't destroy, doesn't wipe out these memories that you can see down below. Okay, by the time we rode the cable car up, and our guide spent a good 2 hours probably walking us around the top of Masada, the various buildings there. There's an old Roman bath and so on. There's ruins of a little synagogue for the people who lived there. The Zealots were up there for 3.5 years before the Romans finally got up to them. But even before that, Herod had people who worked there, lived there. They stored up food that would last for several years there because there was virtually nothing to make it spoil. It's hot and dry, but not moist and damp, something that would rot and mold and so on. So dates and those kind of things. Water was stored in huge cisterns. Those of you who've seen the movies about Masada know about that. Anyway, by the time we got down, it was hot. It was 110, 112 degrees. Just across from the road from Masada, right on the bank of the Dead Sea, is a little place called En-Gedi. And En-Gedi has been there since the time of King David. It was there even before David, but when Saul was trying to kill David, he chased him all the way down to En-Gedi, you may recall. And En-Gedi is still there. It's not a town anymore. It's just a bathhouse for people who want to go in the Dead Sea. It's a little restaurant there, but it's a little oasis. You can see the palm trees and so on. Some have been there a long, long, long time. Anyway, it was hot. By the time those who wanted to swim had been in the waters and got showered off and we had all had lunch, it was 112, 114. We just wanted back on the bus, turn the air conditioner up high. And so now we're exhausted. We've been up a long time. He had gotten us up that morning at 4:30 or 5 or something, and it had been a long day. And we went up this road and kept driving and driving. And suddenly he has the bus pull into a very dusty, hot area to park and said, "All right, let's get out and see Jerusalem." Oh no, aren't we going to Jerusalem, to the hotel, to our wonderful Hilton hotel? No, we're going to see Jericho. And this is 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it is so hot, unbelievably hot. And so we get off the bus, and he leads us over to a big hole in the ground and starts saying, now this strata goes down this far, and this strata this far, and this strata this far. And this convinces archaeologists that this is the oldest continuous settlement on the planet Earth. Jericho, the oldest continuous settlement on the planet. And we're looking in this hole. I mean, it's just a big hole in the ground, unless you're a geologist and you understand all this. And that's where the burn was of this particular period, and that's when it was burned and so on. And we just want to get on the bus and go back to Jerusalem, when he said, no, come with me, come with me. And we turned and walked up a little hill, not a sprig of grass. It is hot, it is dry. And we got to the crest of the hill, and there was Jericho. Jericho is an oasis. Palm trees, green, lemon trees, orange trees, watermelon, cantaloupe, everything that looked moist and wonderful and good. Jericho. It's a beautiful, beautiful little place. Now, today, of course, it's a part of the West Bank, and so it's under Palestinian control. and not as safe a place sometimes for travelers as it had been at one time. Still a very interesting place. Now, Jesus has come down the river road. It's more nearly level. It's descending, of course, but gradually so, from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. Jericho is right on the banks of the Jordan River, just before the water empties into the northernmost part of the Dead Sea. And again, it's about 1,700 feet below sea level. Then there is a climbing road. It's paved and beautiful today, of course, a highway, but basically where the old road went 2,000 years ago, ascending 1,700 feet to sea level, and then another 3,700 or so feet above sea level up into the hills, Jerusalem. You ascend in a 17-mile drive over a mile in elevation. Jesus has come down to Jericho, and now they're going to begin that ascent up the road into Jerusalem. All right, let's pick up there. As they were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. There were 2 blind men sitting by the roadside. When they heard that Jesus was passing by, they shouted, "Kurios!" What have you learned by this time about Matthew? Anyone who calls him Lord is a believer. In Matthew's Gospel, as we go through all 4 of these, and I told you I've already finished the commentary on Mark. It's a new one for me, and I've really enjoyed it. It's wonderfully done, and I know you're going to enjoy it too. I'm about halfway already through Luke, the commentary I've chosen for that, and I'm enjoying it equally as much. They're really, really interesting. And the scholars are pointing out to you why Luke tells his story this way and why Mark tells the story this way and why Luke, because they have different emphases that they think are so important to their readers, to their faith community. So we'll pick up. But in Matthew's Gospel, he is very consistent. Anyone who cries out to him, Kurios, it's the word we have in the Mosaic here in the south end of the Great Hall. In Greek, Kurios, the Lord. If they call out Kurios to him, they're believers. So once you know that about Matthew, you just know it. Here it is. Lord, these blind men say, have mercy on us, Son of David. The crowd sternly ordered them, be quiet. But they shouted even more loudly, have mercy on us, Kurios, Son of David. Jesus stood still, that is, stopped walking, and called them, saying, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, Kurios, 3 times here, Lord, let our eyes be opened. Moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes. Immediately they regained their sight and followed him. Okay, let's see what Dr. Boring says here. Here the focus is on the disciples who, like the blind men, must have their blindness cured by Jesus before they can see the new way of life to which Christian discipleship calls them. Now that's a sentence that sounds very simple, but I want you to think about what he's saying. What is their view of the long-awaited Messiah? Son of David, one who will sit on the throne, one who will rout their enemies, one who will set up a government of justice and peace. He isn't going to do it. He's going to ride that burro down the hill, and they're going to kill him. So they need their blind eyes opened. And you see, when Matthew writes to his faith community, 65 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, he's still trying to convince his readers that to see in Jesus the Messiah of God, they're going to have to change their mind about what they thought a Messiah would do. Understand? So I don't mean there weren't 2 blind men. I'm not implying there were not 2 blind men whose eyes were healed. But I'm saying he's also writing to his readers and saying, you too are blind. You need to see that Messiah has come, but he wasn't what you were expecting. Let's go on. The story as interpreted by Matthew is not a symbolic story of conversion, Why not? Because 3 times they call him Lord already. 3 times the blind men call Jesus Lord, the mark of believers in Matthew's gospel. And twice they even address him as Son of David, a positive and correct Christological, that is, Messiah-centered. Christ is simply the Greek word for the Hebrew Messiah, the correct Christological title in Matthew. He is Son of David. He is the long-awaited one, but he's not going to sit on the throne they're expecting. He'll sit on the throne with God in heaven, not on the throne in Jerusalem. Now, the Markan emphasis, Dr. Boring. Okay, remember, Matthew has in front of him the Gospel of Mark. I've shown you, hopefully, why that is so. Again, if you could read Greek, I have a parallel. You can really see it better in Greek because in English translations, translators sometimes think, well, in this context, this word could mean something slightly different. When you just read the Greek the way it is, Matthew and Luke copy entire paragraphs from Mark at times. They do not vary even a word. We know he's got Mark in front of him. And so what Mark emphasized may not always be what Matthew emphasized. That's what Dr. Boring's lifting up for you. And these best scholars will help you do that. The Markan emphasis on their faith is omitted so that Matthew can concentrate all attention on Jesus' compassion. Only Matthew tells this story about these blind men and mentions that Jesus was moved with compassion. Mark tells the story, doesn't mention. So Matthew thinks that's important, that Jesus has this heart of God. I don't mean Mark didn't believe. I simply mean it's another emphasis for Matthew. He's following along with Mark. He thinks this word compassion needs to be put in there, and he puts it in. It is not their faith that occasioned the healing, however. They already have faith, but Jesus' powerful word. Discipleship is a gift, not an achievement. So, as we read way back there in chapter 9, Matthew, where Mark says there was a blind man, Matthew doubles the number. Says there were 2. Why is that important? Anybody remember why it's important that there be 2? Matthew is writing to people who understand Judaism better than Mark. Mark is writing more to Gentiles. And in Judaism, anytime you're trying to convince a jury or a judge, you need at least 2 witnesses. You need 2. And so Matthew, he reads the story out of Mark. He's copying it word for word. He says there were 2. There were 2. You have to have 2 witnesses, 2 who could tell the story to make it truly believable to everybody. And so Mark says there was a blind man. Matthew says, no, there were 2, Mark. You got it wrong here. There were 2. Surely there are 2 witnesses. Let's go on, chapter 21. When they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage at the Mount of Olives. And let me stop here again. I'm hoping that we can go safely to Israel again. And I know there are people traveling to Israel. I've been afraid. 4 years ago we started trying to put together a group, and then there were several really violent outbreaks. And I'm still not sure just what this change of government in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip in particular, is going to mean. So I'm a little bit afraid. So until I feel safe to take you there, I just won't do that yet. But I want you to see these places if you can. And those who've been there, of course, can remember just what this looks like. As you come up the road, this winding road, one of our guides one year, we had a woman who was particularly good, Gail and I thought, and some of you as well. And she's the one, as we were ascending this road, and we're usually ready to get on to the places we know about. And it's always hot in the summertime there. It doesn't rain for that 7-month period. And so suddenly Lila said to Lila, she called it, didn't it? Lila said to the driver, pull over. As we pulled over beside this major highway, and it's blistering hot, there are a little group of tents out there. Now, they don't look like the old army tents. They're much broader and wider. They always seem to be made out of black material, black in this heat. And the sides are rolled up, and there's a fire in the middle. And one of my ministers down in Texas, John Hassler one time researched American Indian teepees and discovered that if you build a little fire in the center, it draws a breeze in and up through the top. That you might think you're doing the wrong thing to build a fire, you can be doing the very right thing. And so they build a little fire in the center, and the air coming in to feed the fire creates a little breeze. But anyway, bus pulled over beside the road, and all of a sudden our guide said, "Did you see Abraham and Sarah?" And everybody, "What?" "This is Abraham and Sarah. They've been doing this for 4,000 years that we know about. Anybody want to visit Abraham and Sarah?" And "No, we want to go to the hotel." "Oh, let's visit Abraham and Sarah." And so those who wanted to got off the bus. And of course, hospitality dictates they're supposed to serve you some hot tea. And so quickly the women are scurrying around. These are Bedouins. And this is the way Abraham and Sarah lived. Okay. You approach Jerusalem, and just outside the walled city, several little towns. Bethany is one of them. Bethphage, another one of them. And again, as the bus pulls up, you're right on the top of the Mount of Olives. This is not Pikes Peak. This is not Mount Everest. It's just a little hill. But the bus pulls up and you get off and you are looking at the old city. You're looking from the east toward the west. There's the old city. And here's a little winding trail down that Jesus rode the burro. Today there's a big cemetery on one side and the Church of All Nations on the other side. You have old olive trees, some of them 2,000 years old. It is the Mount of Olives. Beautiful bougainvillea have always been blooming when we've been there. We've had 5 opportunities to go, and the bougainvillea is blooming. It's really, really beautiful. There's a little trickling brook in the summer when it doesn't rain much, probably much heavier in the winter. I've never been there in the winter. A little brook called the Kidron Valley. And just immediately you walk across a little bridge and you're looking right at what was the old east entrance to the walled city. It's just 100 yards, it seems to me, about 100 yards from the little bridge right up to the wall portion of the old city. So that's where Jesus and the disciples are so close now. At the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this: the Kurios, the Lord needs them, and he will send them immediately." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." And this is a part the soprano soloist sings in Handel's Messiah. About, "Behold, he is coming unto you. Behold your king, he is coming unto you on a donkey." That's what Zechariah said would happen. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and that followed were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." And the Lord, of course, for them is the one at the burning bush. The Eye Asher Eye, I am who I am. Hosanna in the highest heaven. When he entered Jerusalem, that would be the old walled portion, the part that sits right at the top of the hill. They could close the gates every night and hopefully sleep safely. The next morning, watchmen would be on the walls looking for the possible approach of an enemy. When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." Okay, let's see what Dr. Boring has to say. Monday, he says, in the Matthean storyline, this is Jesus' first appearance in Jerusalem. Now let me remind you, the synoptics, Mark and Matthew in particular, mention only one trip to Jerusalem in his whole life, the one where he would be killed. Luke says he was there once before when he was 12 years old. Only Luke tells that story of his being there as a boy when he was 12, at a bar mitzvah age, if you would. It's John who tells us he was there on 3 different Passover occasions. And so it's John's gospel that has caused us to believe his ministry lasted 3 years. The others don't say it didn't last 3 years. They just say he went only once. But if John says he went 3 times after he began his ministry, then that would be 3 years. And that's where we get that. But Matthew has not mentioned Jesus ever having been in Jerusalem until now. The way he knows the story, the way he chooses to tell it, just one time. We cannot know for sure about that. In the Matthean, that is Matthew's storyline, this is Jesus' first appearance in Jerusalem, the city that joined with wicked King Herod in being so troubled when Jesus was born just 5 miles away in the little town of Bethlehem. The traditional Palm Sunday hardly fits Matthew's version of the story. This riding the donkey is narrated in all 4 Gospels, but palms are mentioned only in John, and in Matthew's chronology, the whole thing happened on Monday, not Sunday. So the way they tell the story is a little different here. Matthew follows his Markan source closely, but he makes 3 significant changes. Notice again, this is why we call them the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. That each is trying to emphasize the story of Jesus the way he believes it tells best and will win more the best way possible. And so Matthew's reading the story, maybe the one who taught him, the one who helped him become a disciple, told it to him slightly differently, but he's following Mark's basic outline and Mark's basic telling of the story. He changes 3 things. First, the image of Zechariah, chapter 9, had already made an impact on the pre-Markan form of the story and perhaps influenced even Jesus' own symbolic act. That is, Jesus may have chosen to do all this because he knew it was in Zechariah as well. It's important to Matthew to make the reference to Scripture. Mark doesn't do that. Matthew says this was done in order to fulfill. The quotation is not tacked on, but is fundamental to Matthew's understanding of the whole event, causing him to rewrite verse 1 to emphasize the Mount of Olives, scene of the eschatological, meaning end-time event that Zechariah describes in chapter 14. Zechariah is the Hebrew Scriptures. It's the Old Testament. But he said Messiah will come on Mount of Olives. And Matthew says Mount of Olives. Mark doesn't point out the specific place. And he doesn't point out the specific place, and he doesn't specifically say this was done in order to fulfill, and it's direct quote from Zechariah. Okay. Also, he's following Zechariah in talking about 2 animals. Did you notice? Not only will you find this little Jenny, you will find her colt. Bring them to me. Zechariah. Matthew omits Zechariah's characterization of the king as righteous and saving in order to place all the emphasis on Jesus that he thinks his hearers need to concentrate on. Humble, gentle. An humble and gentle king redefines the nature of kingship. It's trying to help them understand. Messiah has come. He wasn't what you were looking for. God sent one you weren't expecting, but he's the real one. Trust he's the real one. Okay, number 2. In this scene, Matthew explicitly adds crowds 3 times to the Markan narrative. Mark doesn't talk about there being huge crowds, maybe just a band of followers. Matthew thinks this is so important. He mentions crowds 3 times. These crowds paved Jesus' way into the city with shouts of acclamation, with their own cloaks and branches, reminiscent of the jubilant royal entrances and processions of Solomon, when David had completed the major part of the city, the oldest part, and Solomon has added the magnificent temple. The crowds use words directly from Psalm 118, the last of the psalms that are called Hallel psalms. They are sung at Passover time, to this day, by the Jews. These Hallel psalms are The center part of that word is El, Elohim, God. And we have this El, the trilling of the little uvula in the roof of the mouth that women in particular still do in the Middle East when they're very happy or grieving, either one. To express extreme emotion, they vibrate the little uvula in the roof of their mouth, and their tongues going la 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 la, like so. And to say El is Yah ends up for us being Alleluia. See? It's where we get the word Alleluia. Alleluia. And Matthew helps us here with this Hallel psalm, sung at Passover, sung by these crowds, shouted out to Jesus. Hosanna was originally a prayer. In Hebrew, this word means save, I pray you. Save us, or me, I pray you. But by the first century, that is the first century of the Common Era, he means, had become a contentless, festive shout, something like a religious hoorah. Number 3, Matthew adds verses 10 and 11, in which the crowds who have accompanied Jesus through the narrative now identify him to the city's inhabitants. As Matthew tells it, these people in Jerusalem don't have a clue who he is. Why is there such an uproar here with this person? You don't know? This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth up in Galilee. The people of Jerusalem are shaken by Jesus' appearance. The crowd's identification of Jesus as prophet is not incorrect. He is that, though Matthew's been trying to show us, and will try even harder the last few chapters, to show us that he was far more than a prophet. He was like Moses, he was like Elijah, but far more, and the Mount of Transfiguration is supposed to have shown the closest to the disciples that he's transfigured with Moses and Elijah, but they disappear, and the disciples see only Jesus at that point. Matthew knows that the crowd will finally fail, and later in the week will shout, "Crucify him." But here their problem is not their Christology is being incorrect, but that they will not transform their words into deeds. These who are shouting for him will fade away when the going really gets tough. Let's go on, verse 12. Then Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of robbers." The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them. But when the chief priest and the scribes saw the amazing things that he did, and heard the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they became angry and said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yes. Have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies you have prepared praise for yourself?" He left them, went out of the city to Bethany, and spent the night there. Again, those of you who've been to Jerusalem, let me remind you that there is a fair amount of space up on the top of the Temple Mount, as you recall. There are 2 mosques up there today. You have the El Aqsa Mosque, which has a silver-looking dome on top of it, where you had a horrible murder some years ago in the royal family of Palestinians. And then you have the gold-covered one, which is called the Dome of the Rock. And you can go into both, have to take your shoes off, as is customary in a mosque. Take your shoes off and leave them outside, but you can go in. They're usually covered with rugs of the Middle East, Persian, Egyptian, or whatever. All kinds of beautiful, fancy rugs in there, and usually no other particular furniture in a mosque. They don't sit so much. They stand and kneel and stand and kneel and so on. In the Dome of the Rock, the Islamic people hold that this is the same outcropping where Abraham was willing to offer up his son, but of course they say instead of Isaac, they say it was Ishmael that he was willing to offer, and that God didn't require that of him, and Ishmael was spared. The Jews say Isaac, of course, was spared. And that this outcropping of rock, they discovered, archaeologists did, little corings out, chiselings out of the rock, which they take to have been blood flow from multiple animal sacrifices offered way back there in sacrificial times. Nobody's offering animal sacrifice there now, have not, but where the Jews did offer animal sacrifice back before the time of Jesus. After the destruction of their temple in 70 A.D., first century of the Common Era, no Jews have offered any blood sacrifice for more than 1900 years. What I'm trying to help you remember is that there is a mosque, and then there's a big, wide, pretty open expanse on the top of the mountain there. And then you go up just a few steps, and there's another fairly wide expanse, and then you come to the Dome of the Rock. What I'm saying is that the temple that the Jews had built had different porticos, different places. As down at the wall, women are allowed in some places, only males in other places. In the temple built by Solomon, then rebuilt by Ezra, Nehemiah, enhanced by Herod the Great, there were several different areas. And just one of those areas, one part, was where they exchanged monies and sold animals for sacrifice and so on. Just sort of envision that. We're not talking about the holiest place, the Holy of Holies and so on. That's not where they were carrying on this commerce. But what Jesus saw upset him. And let's see what Dr. Boring says about that. The temple, in this case, refers to the whole complex of buildings and courts that made up the temple precinct. Today, it would be sort of like the Vatican. Those of you who've been to the Vatican know that it's a little nation all to itself. It's about 120 acres, I believe. It's about 120 acres or so in the Vatican. And most people are familiar with St. Peter's Basilica. But that's a relatively small part of the 100. It's not an unimportant part, of course. It's magnificent and beautiful and the focal point. But the Vatican grounds have a lot of other things too. Beautiful gardens and so on. Long hallways with art and art and art and more art and the Sistine Chapel and so on. It's a big complex, and that's all Dr. Boring's trying to tell you. The temple of Jesus' time was as well. He's wanting to emphasize this is not the Holy of Holies, entered only by the high priest on the day of Yom Kippur each year. As a Jewish layperson, Jesus was not a priest. Jesus could enter the court of Israel, but not the sanctuary proper. This encounter takes place in the large court of the Gentiles. Even Gentiles could come and pray to the Jewish God, but they got only so far and no farther. In the court of the Gentiles, animals were sold for sacrifice, and money was exchanged into the coinage acceptable for gifts to the temple. Foreign currency, often displaying idolatrous symbols, that is, people, rulers, royalty of those various countries, was inappropriate for temple use. The temple complex was large in Jesus' day. It included an enormous barn with stalls for thousands of sacrificial animals, accommodations for the people who handled, fed, looked after all of those animals, and a slaughterhouse. The temple was long since gone by the time Matthew wrote his gospel. It was destroyed by the Romans, remember, in 70. Matthew's not writing, we think, until maybe 85 or 90. So 15, 20 years, it's all gone. He's writing about a temple that had once been there, not there when he writes, not there for his readers. And, of course, never rebuilt. Not rebuilt until Muhammad the Prophet came along and the Islamic people took the hill and built their own mosque up there in time. Never a temple after 70 A.D. By adding here the two additional scenes in the temple, adding to what Mark wrote, Matthew has transformed it. Jesus himself replaces the temple as the locus of God's presence among the people. Now let me stop and help you think about that just a second. Since the time of Solomon, that David lived in the year 1000, Solomon about 950 or so when he was ruling. So for 1,000 years, the first temple and then its replacement had been, they knew God was everywhere. God is not confined, and their prophets said God is not confined to a place. But when they wanted to feel closest to God, it was in the temple. And what Dr. Boring is contending is that Matthew is saying to those who read his gospel, There is no temple. There is no temple sitting on top of that hill. The locus of God's presence is Jesus of Nazareth. You want to feel closest to God? You want to be in the very presence of the Almighty? You get as close to Jesus of Nazareth, our Christ, as you possibly can. Here Matthew says Jesus performs 3 acts. First, he casts out both buyers and sellers and turns over the tables of the money changers. How many of you have been to Delphi in Greece? Several. Okay, you remember the stories that you heard up at Delphi. There was a woman, Oracle, the Oracle of Delphi, you remember. And she became so popular. There were so many people who really believed she could foretell their future, could foretell the future of Athens and Corinth and Greek people and individuals, that they brought sacrifices. There are many beautiful little buildings up there, little temples and so on that people built for her, in her honor, and so on, to please her, so they'd get a good reading from her and so on. When we were there, and we've been there a couple of times, our guide said finally so many animals were being brought that they simply couldn't kill them all. They couldn't sacrifice them all. Because remember, most of the time the animals weren't burned up. Just the innards and so on most often. The rest were sort of barbecued and everybody got to participate and got to eat. But they found there were so many animals, they just couldn't slaughter and process them all. And so our guide said they have evidence that people were bringing their animals up one side of the mountain. They had to use money that she would accept, so they had, like they get to us now when we have to exchange our currency. They get you coming in, they get you going out. They take advantage. You have to convert, and always there's a premium for exchanging into the currency of the realm. Well, that's what they did at Delphi. That's what they did in Jerusalem. And then these same animals, many of them were taken down the opposite side of the mountain, around the hill, and resold. And brought up, taken down, around the hill, and resold, and brought up, and so on. She had a going thing there. So if you get a chance to see Delphi, it's an interesting place. Okay, so Jesus turns over the money tables, the money changers, and so on. Number 2, Matthew says that Jesus cast out the insiders. Those who are, remember, Matthew's gospel is about the reversal of things. Those last will become first. The rich become poor. Poor become rich in the kingdom of God, and so forth. So here Jesus casts out those who think they're in and welcomes those who've been kept out. The neglected, the excluded, the blind, the lame, and children who are to be rarely seen and never heard. Number 3, Jesus accepts the acclamation of the children. Matthew has the children crying out, Son of David, Son of David, and he accepts that as being authentic. Jesus, as Son of David, Matthew believes, will build a community. Not a building like the temple on the top of Mount Moriah. Jesus becomes the focus of God's presence in the world, and the community that so honors him will become the focus of God's presence in the world. That's what Matthew believes. Jesus is not at home in Jerusalem. That's not his home. He finds lodging outside the city like many other pilgrims at the festival. And here again, Josephus, who was a reputable historian of that first century, says that when the people came for Passover, there were so many, they simply could not all stay inside the wall portion of the city. And that you could look around the hills and see campfires and campfires by the hundreds. People camping out, coming back into the city the next day. Where Bethlehem was 5 miles, roughly outside the walled city, Bethany was only 3. One of the gospel writers tells us it was about 3 miles. Not if you went straight up over Mount Zion, this little hill, boom, you're at Bethany. We've been to the tomb that they say was the tomb of Lazarus. Lazarus, Mary, Martha lived at Bethany, you recall. And so, but if you go the easier walk, not straight up the hill, but a winding path, it's about 3 miles. And Jesus went out there with his disciples to spend the night. Left the wall portion of the city. Okay, let's go on. Verse 18. In the morning, now here some of these gospels tend to say, okay, he rode down the hill on Sunday, rode on the donkey on Sunday. Matthew, if you add it up carefully, it looks like he's saying that happened on Monday. And so the next morning, so for Matthew, this looks like Tuesday. Dr. Boring says, for Matthew, now we're at Tuesday. In the morning, when Jesus returned to the city, he was hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the side of the road, he went to it and found nothing at all on it but leaves, no figs. Then he said to it, may no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. When the disciples saw it, they were amazed, saying, how did the fig tree wither at once, meaning immediately? Jesus answered them, truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only will you do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the sea, it will be done. Whatever you ask for in prayer with faith, you will receive. Okay, Dr. Boren's take on this. This is Tuesday. Matthew found this story in the Gospel of Mark, where the two acts of pronouncing judgment on the tree on one day and it discovering it withered on the next day interpreted Jesus' action in the temple. Okay, let me stop there just to help you with that. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus sees the fig tree not bearing fruit as he goes into the city. And then he has this encounter, turning over the tables and all sorts of things. And the next day when he comes back, it's withered. In Matthew's Gospel, it happens in the stroke of light. It withers right in front of their eyes. Matthew eliminates the troublesome Markan note. Mark says it was not the season for figs. Passover happens when our Easter does. Rather, our Easter happens when Passover does. And so figs aren't ripe so early in the springtime. Mark knows that. Matthew chooses not to mention that it wasn't the time for figs. Mark says it was not the season for figs, but the difficulty of Jesus using his miraculous power for destructive purposes remains. What's the meaning of this strange story? Dr. Boring says most interpreters have seen the fig tree as symbolic of the nation Israel. Hence, they regard the cursing as a symbol of God's judgment on fruitless Judaism, or at least the leadership of Judaism of that day. Matthew seems to present the story as a symbolic act prefiguring the condemnation of those in the following parables. He's about to go into a long teaching session here, and most of them are parable. He's trying to prefigure the condemnation of those in the following parables who do not bring forth the authentic fruits of righteousness and justice. Anybody who doesn't practice right standing and doesn't do what is just, fair, right. Matthew uses fruits as a metaphor for good works 17 times in his gospel. So, the Lord comes seeking fruit from the tree, and when he finds only leaves, he causes it to wither. Since Jesus points to the power of faith as the meaning of the incident, it is not some power possessed by himself alone, but he and the believers share the role of being vehicles of God's divine power. We better stop.